Chapter 16 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 16. By this elaborate historical example, we have endeavored to make it clear that tragedy perishes as surely by evanescence of the spirit of music as it can be born only out of this spirit. In order to qualify the singularity of this assertion, and on the other hand, to disclose the source of this insight of ours, we must now confront with clear vision the analogous phenomena of the present time. We must enter into the midst of these struggles which, as I said just now, are being carried on in the highest spheres of our present world, between the insatiate optimistic perception and the tragic need of art. In so doing, I shall leave out of consideration all other antagonistic tendencies which, at all times, oppose art, especially tragedy, and which at present again extend their sway triumphantly to such an extent that of the theatrical arts only the farce and the ballet, for example, put forth their blossoms, which perhaps not everyone cares to smell, intolerably rich luxuriance. I will speak only of the most illustrious opposition to the tragic conception of things, and by this I mean essentially optimistic science, with its ancestor Socrates at the head of it. Presently, also, the forces will be designated which seem to me to guarantee a rebirth of tragedy, and who knows what other blessed hopes for the German genius. Before we plunge into the midst of these struggles, let us array ourselves in the armor of our hitherto acquired knowledge. In contrast to all those who are intent on deriving the arts from one exclusive principle, as the necessary vital source of every work of art, I keep my eyes fixed on the two artistic deities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus, and recognize in them the living and conspicuous representative of two worlds of art, which differ in their intrinsic essence and in their highest aims. Apollo stands before me as the transfiguring genius of the principium individuationis, through which alone the redemption in appearance is to be truly attained, while by the mystical cheer of Dionysus the spell of individuation is broken, and the way lies open to the mothers of being, to the innermost heart of things. This extraordinary antithesis, which opens up yawning between plastic art as the Apollonian and music as the Dionysian art, has become manifest to only one of the great thinkers to such an extent that even without this key to the symbolism of the Hellenic divinities, he allowed to music a different character and origin in advance of all the other arts, because, unlike them, it is not a copy of the phenomenon, but a direct copy of the will itself, and therefore represents the metaphysical of everything physical in the world, the thing in itself of every phenomenon. Schopenhauer, Welt aus Wille und Vorstellung, 1-310. To this most important perception of aesthetics, with which, taken in a serious sense, aesthetics properly commences, Richard Wagner, by way of confirmation of its eternal truth, affixed his seal, when he asserted in his Beethoven that music must be judged according to aesthetic principles quite different from those which apply to the plastic arts, and not in general according to the category of beauty, although an erroneous aesthetics inspired by a misled and degenerate art has, by virtue of the concept of beauty prevailing in the plastic domain, accustomed itself to demand of music an effect analogous to that of the works of plastic art, namely, the suscitating delight in beautiful forms. Upon perceiving this extraordinary antithesis, I felt a strong inducement to approach the essence of Greek tragedy, and by means of it the profoundest revelation of Hellenic genius. For I at last thought myself to be in possession of a charm to enable me, far beyond the phraseology of our usual aesthetics, to represent vividly to my mind the primitive problem of tragedy, whereby such an astounding insight into the Hellenic character was afforded me, that it necessarily seemed as if our proudly comforting classico-Hellenic science had thus far contrived to subsist almost exclusively on phantasmagoria and externalities. Perhaps we may lead up to this primitive problem with the question: what aesthetic effect results when the intrinsically separate art powers, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, enter into concurrent actions? Or, in briefer form, how is music related to image and concept? Schopenhauer, whom Richard Wagner, with a special reference to this point, accredits with an unsurpassable clearness and perspicuity of exposition, expresses himself most copiously on the subject in the following passage, which I shall cite here at full length, from Welt als Wille und Vorstellung 1, page 309, quote, "According to all this, we may regard the phenomenal world of nature and music as two different expressions of the same thing, which is therefore itself the only medium of the analogy between these two expressions, so that a knowledge of this medium is required in order to understand that analogy. Music, therefore, if regarded as an expression of the world, is in the highest degree a universal language, which is related indeed to the universality of concepts, much as these are related to the particular things. Its universality, however, is by no means the empty universality of abstraction, but of quite a different kind, and is united with thorough and distinct definiteness. In this respect, it resembles geometrical figures and numbers, which are the universal forms of all possible objects of experience and applicable to them all a priori, and yet are not abstract, but perceptible and thoroughly determinate. All possible efforts, excitements, and manifestations of will, all that goes on in the heart of man, and that reason includes in the wide, negative concept of feeling, may be expressed by the infinite number of possible melodies, but always in the universality of mere form, without the material, always according to the thing in itself, not the phenomenon, of which they reproduce the very soul and essence, as it were, without the body. This deep relation which music bears to the true nature of all things also explains the fact that suitable music played to any scene, action, event, or surrounding seems to disclose to us its most secret meaning, and appears as the most accurate and distinct commentary upon it, as also the fact that whoever gives himself up entirely to the impression of a symphony seems to see all the possible events of life and the world take place in himself. Nevertheless, upon reflection, he can find no likeness between the music and the things that passed before his mind, for, as we have said, music is distinguished from all the other arts by the fact that it is not a copy of the phenomenon, or, more accurately, the adequate objectivity of the will, but the direct copy of the will itself, and therefore represents the metaphysical of everything physical in the world, and the thing in itself of every phenomenon. We might therefore just as well call the world embodied music as embodied will, and this is the reason why music makes every picture and indeed every scene of real life and of the world, at once appear with higher significance, all the more so, to be sure, in proportion as its melody is analogous to the inner spirit of the given phenomenon. It rests upon this, that we are able to set a poem to music as a song, or a perceptible representation as a pantomime, or both as an opera. Such particular pictures of human life, set to the universal language of music, are never bound to it, or correspond to it with stringent necessity, but stand to it only in the relation of an example chosen at will to a general concept. In the determinateness of the real, they represent that which music expresses in the universality of mere form. For melodies are, to a certain extent, like general concepts, an abstraction from the actual. This actual world, then, the world of particular things, affords the object of perception, the special and the individual, the particular case, both to the universality of concepts and to the universality of the melodies. But these two universalities are in a certain respect opposed to each other, for the concepts contain only the forms, which are first of all abstracted from perception, the separated outward shell of things, as it were, and hence they are, in the strictest sense of the term, abstracta. Music, on the other hand, gives the inmost kernel which precedes all forms, or the heart of things. This relation may be very well expressed in the language of the schoolmen by saying, the concepts are the universalia post rem, but music gives the universalia ante rem, and the real world the universalia in re. But that in general a relation is possible between a composition and a perceptible representation rests, as we have said, upon the fact that both are simply different expressions of the same inner being of the world. When now, in the particular case, such a relation is actually given, that is to say, when the composer has been able to express in the universal language of music the emotions of will, which constitute the heart of an event, then the melody of the song, the music of the opera, is expressive. But the analogy discovered by the composer between the two must have proceeded from the direct knowledge of the nature of the world, unknown to his reason, and must not be an imitation, produced with conscious intention by means of conceptions. Otherwise, the music does not express the inner nature of the will itself, but merely gives an inadequate imitation of its phenomenon. All specially imitative music does this. End quote. We have therefore, according to the doctrine of Schopenhauer, an immediate understanding of music as the language of the will, and feel our imagination stimulated to give form to this invisible and yet so actively stirred spirit world which speaks to us, and prompted to embody it in an analogous example. On the other hand, image and concept, under the influence of a truly conformable music, acquire a higher significance. Dionysian art, therefore, is wont to exercise two kinds of influences on the Apollonian art faculty. Music firstly incites to the symbolic intuition of Dionysian universality, and secondly, it causes the symbolic image to stand forth in its fullest significance. From these facts, intelligible in themselves, and not inaccessible to profounder observation, I infer the capacity of music to give birth to myth. That is to say, the most significant exemplar and precisely tragic myth. The myth which speaks of Dionysian knowledge in symbols. In the phenomenon of the lyrist, I have set forth that in him music strives to express itself with regard to its nature in Apollonian images. If now we reflect that music in its highest potency must seek to attain also to its highest symbolization, we must deem it possible that it also knows how to find the symbolic expression of its inherent Dionysian wisdom. And where shall we have to seek for this expression, if not in tragedy, and in general, in the conception of the tragic? From the nature of art, as it is ordinarily conceived according to the single category of appearance and beauty, the tragic cannot be honestly deduced at all. It is only through the spirit of music that we understand the joy and the annihilation of the individual. For in the particular examples of such annihilation, only is the eternal phenomenon of Dionysian art made clear to us, which gives expression to the will in its omnipotence, as it were, behind the principium individuationis, the eternal life beyond all phenomena, and in spite of all annihilation. The metaphysical delight in the tragic is a translation of the instinctively unconscious Dionysian wisdom into the language of the scene. The hero, the highest manifestation of the will, is disavowed for our pleasure, because he is only phenomenon, and because the eternal life of the will is not affected by his annihilation. Quote, "We believe in eternal life," end quote. Tragedy exclaims, while music is the proximate idea of this life. Plastic art has an altogether different object. Here Apollo vanquishes the suffering of the individual by the radiant glorification of the eternity of the phenomenon. Here beauty triumphs over the suffering inherent in life. Pain is in a manner surreptitiously obliterated from the features of nature. In Dionysian art, in its tragic symbolism, the same nature speaks to us, with its true undissembled voice. Quote, "Be as I am. Amidst the ceaseless change of phenomena, the eternally creative primordial mother, eternally impelling to existence, self-satisfying eternally with this change of phenomena." End quote. End of chapter 16. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 17 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. Dionysian art, too, seeks to convince us of the eternal joy of existence. Only we are to seek this joy not in phenomena, but behind phenomena. We are to perceive how all that comes into being must be ready for a sorrowful end. We are compelled to look into the terrors of individual existence. Yet we are not to become torpid. A metaphysical comfort tears us momentarily from the bustle of the transforming figures. We are really, for brief moments, primordial being itself, and feel its indomitable desire for being and joy in existence. The struggle, the pain, the destruction of phenomena now appear to us as something necessary, considering the surplus of innumerable forms of existence which throng and push one another into life, considering the exuberant fertility of the universal will. We are pierced by the maddening sting of these pains at the very moment when we have become, as it were, one with the immeasurable primordial joy in existence, and when we anticipate, in Dionysian ecstasy, the indestructibility and eternity of this joy. In spite of fear and pity, we are the happy living beings, not as individuals, but as the one living being with whose procreative joy we are blended. The history of the rise of Greek tragedy now tells us with luminous precision that the tragic art of the Greeks was really born of the spirit of music. With which conception we believe we have done justice for the first time to the original and most astonishing significance of the chorus. At the same time, however, we must admit that the import of tragic myth, as set forth above, never became transparent with sufficient lucidity to the Greek poets, let alone the Greek philosophers. Their heroes speak, as it were, more superficially than they act. The myth does not at all find its adequate objectification in the spoken word. The structure of the scenes and the conspicuous images reveal a deeper wisdom than the poet himself can put into words and concepts. The same being also observed in Shakespeare, whose Hamlet, for instance, in an analogous manner, talks more superficially than he acts, so that the previously mentioned lesson of Hamlet is to be gathered not from his words, but from a more profound contemplation and survey of the whole. With respect to Greek tragedy, which of course presents itself to us only as word drama, I have even intimated that the incongruence between myth and expression might easily tempt us to regard it as shallower and less significant than it really is, and accordingly to postulate for it a more superficial effect than it must have had, according to the testimony of the ancients. For how easily one forgets that what the word poet did not succeed in doing, namely realizing the highest spiritualization and ideality of myth, he might succeed in doing every moment as creative musician. We require, to be sure, almost by philological method, to reconstruct for ourselves the ascendancy of musical influence in order to receive something of the incomparable comfort which must be characteristic of true tragedy. Even this musical ascendancy, however, would only have been felt by us as such had we been Greeks. While in the entire development of Greek music, as compared with the infinitely richer music known and familiar to us, we imagine we hear only the youthful song of the musical genius, intoned with a feeling of diffidence. The Greeks are, as the Egyptian priests say, eternal children, and in tragic art also they are only children who do not know what a sublime plaything has originated under their hands, and is being demolished. That striving of the spirit of music for symbolic and mythical manifestation, which increases from the beginnings of lyric poetry to Attic tragedy, breaks off, all of a sudden, immediately after attaining luxuriant development, and disappears, as it were, from the surface of Hellenic art, while the Dionysian view of things, born of this striving, lives on in mysteries, and in its strangest metamorphoses and debasements, does not cease to attract earnest natures. Will it not one day rise again as art out of its mystic depth? Here the question occupies us, whether the power by the counteracting influence of which tragedy perished has for all time strength enough to prevent the artistic reawaking of tragedy, and of the tragic view of things. If ancient tragedy was driven from its course by the dialectical desire for knowledge and the optimism of science, it might be inferred that there is an eternal conflict between the theoretic and the tragic view of things, and only after the spirit of science has been led to its boundaries, and its claim to universal validity has been destroyed by the evidence of these boundaries, can we hope for a rebirth of tragedy, for which form of culture we should have to use the symbol of the music-practicing Socrates, in the sense spoken of above. In this contrast, I understand by the spirit of science the belief which first came to light in the person of Socrates, the belief in the fathomableness of nature, and in knowledge as a panacea. He who recalls the immediate consequences of this restlessly onward-pressing spirit of science will realize at once that myth was annihilated by it, and that in consequence of this annihilation, poetry was driven as a homeless being from her natural ideal soil. If we have rightly assigned to music the capacity to reproduce myth from itself, we may in turn expect to find the spirit of science on the path where it inimically opposes this mythopoeic power of music. This takes place in the development of the new Attic dithyramb, the music of which no longer expressed the inner essence, the will itself, but only rendered the phenomenon insufficiently, in an imitation by means of concepts, from which intrinsically degenerate music the truly musical natures turned away, with the same repugnance that they felt for the art-destroying tendency of Socrates. The unerring instinct of Aristophanes surely did the proper thing when it comprised Socrates himself, the tragedy of Euripides, and the music of the new dithyrambic poets in the same feeling of hatred, and perceived in all these three phenomena the symptoms of a degenerate culture. By this new dithyramb, music has in an outrageous manner been made the imitative portrait of phenomena, for instance of a battle or a storm at sea, and has thus, of course, been entirely deprived of its mythopoeic power. For if it endeavors to excite our delight only by compelling us to seek external analogies between a vital or natural process and certain rhythmical figures and characteristic sounds of music, if our understanding is expected to satisfy itself with the perception of these analogies, we are reduced to a frame of mind in which the reception of the mythical is impossible. For the myth as a unique exemplar of generality and truth, towering into the infinite, desires to be conspicuously perceived. The truly Dionysian music presents itself to us as such a general mirror of the universal will. The conspicuous event which is refracted in this mirror expands at once for our consciousness to the copy of an eternal truth. Conversely, such a conspicuous event is at once divested of every mythical character by the tone painting of the new dithyramb. Music has here become a wretched copy of the phenomenon, and therefore infinitely poorer than the phenomenon itself, through which poverty it still further reduces even the phenomenon for our consciousness, so that now, for instance, a musically imitated battle of this sort exhausts itself in marches, signal sounds, etc., and our imagination is arrested precisely by these superficialities. Tone painting is therefore in every respect the counterpart of true music, with its mythopoeic power. Through it the phenomenon, poor in itself, is made still poorer, while through an isolated Dionysian music, the phenomenon is evolved and expanded into a picture of the world. It was an immense triumph of the non-Dionysian spirit, when in the development of the new dithyramb, it had estranged music from itself and reduced it to be the slave of phenomena. Euripides, who, albeit in a higher sense, must be designated as a thoroughly unmusical nature, is for this very reason a passionate adherent of the new dithyrambic music, and with the liberality of a freebooter, employs all its effective turns and mannerisms. In another direction, also, we see at work the power of this un-Dionysian myth-opposing spirit, when we turn our eyes to the prevalence of character representation and psychological refinement from Sophocles onwards. The character must no longer be expanded into an eternal type, but on the contrary, must operate individually through artistic by-traits and shadings, through the nicest precision of all lines, in such a manner that the spectator is in general no longer conscious of the myth, but of the mighty nature myth and the imitative power of the artist. Here also we observe the victory of the phenomenon over the universal, and the delight in the particular quasi-anatomical preparation. We actually breathe the air of a theoretical world, in which scientific knowledge is valued more highly than the artistic reflection of a universal law. The movement along the line of the representation of character proceeds rapidly. While Sophocles still delineates complete characters and employs myth for their refined development, Euripides already delineates only prominent individual traits of character, which can express themselves in violent bursts of passion. In the New Attic comedy, however, there are only masks with one expression: frivolous old men, duped panders, and cunning slaves in untiring repetition. Where now is the mythopoeic spirit of music? What is still left now of music is either excitatory music or souvenir music. That is, either a stimulant for dull and used-up nerves, or tone painting. As regards the former, it hardly matters about the text set to it. The heroes and choruses of Euripides are already dissolute enough when they once begin to sing. To what pass must things have come with his brazen successors? The new un-Dionysian spirit, however, manifests itself most clearly in the denouements of the new dramas. In the old tragedy one could feel at the close the metaphysical comfort, without which the delight in tragedy cannot be explained at all. The conciliating tones from another world sound purest, perhaps, in the Oedipus at Colonus. Now that the genius of music has fled from tragedy, tragedy is, strictly speaking, dead. For from whence could one now draw the metaphysical comfort? One sought, therefore, for an earthly unravelment of the tragic dissonance. The hero, after he had been sufficiently tortured by fate, reaped a well-deserved reward through a superb marriage, or divine tokens of favor. The hero had turned gladiator, on whom, after being liberally battered about and covered with wounds, freedom was occasionally bestowed. The deus ex machina took the place of metaphysical comfort. I will not say that the tragic view of things was everywhere completely destroyed by the intruding spirit of the un-Dionysian. We only know that it was compelled to flee from art, into the underworld, as it were, in the degenerate form of a secret cult. Over the widest extent of the Hellenic character, however, there raged the consuming blast of this spirit, which manifests itself in the form of, quote, Greek cheerfulness, end quote, which we have already spoken of as a senile, unproductive love of existence. This cheerfulness is the counterpart of the splendid naivete of the earlier Greeks, which, according to the characteristic indicated above, must be conceived as the blossom of the Apollonian culture, growing out of a dark abyss. as the victory which the Hellenic will, through its mirroring of beauty, obtains over the suffering and the wisdom of suffering. The noblest manifestation of that other form of Greek cheerfulness, this Alexandrine, is the cheerfulness of the theoretical man. It exhibits the same symptomatic characteristics as I have just inferred concerning the spirit of the un-Dionysian. It combats Dionysian wisdom and art. It seeks to dissolve a myth. It substitutes for metaphysical comfort in earthly consonance. In fact, a deus ex machina of its own, namely the god of machines and crucibles. That is, the powers of the genii of nature recognized and employed in the service of higher egoism. It believes in amending the world by knowledge, in guiding life by science, and that it can really confine the individual within a narrow sphere of solvable problems, where he cheerfully says to life, quote, "I desire thee, it is worth while to know thee." End quote. End of chapter 17. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 19 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. We cannot designate the intrinsic substance of Socratic culture more distinctly than by calling it the culture of the opera. For it is in this department that culture has expressed itself with special naivete concerning its aims and perceptions, which is sufficiently surprising when we compare the genesis of the opera and the facts of operatic development with the eternal truths of the Apollonian and Dionysian. I call to mind, first of all, the origin of the stilo rappresentativo and the recitative. Is it credible that this thoroughly externalized operatic music, incapable of devotion, could be received and cherished with enthusiastic favor as a rebirth, as it were, of all true music, by the very age in which the ineffably sublime and sacred music of Palestrina had originated? And who, on the other hand, would think of making only the diversion-craving luxuriousness of those Florentine circles, and the vanity of their dramatic singers, responsible for the love of the opera which spread with such rapidity? That in the same age, even among the same people, this passion for a half-musical mode of speech should awaken alongside of the vaulted structure of Palestrine harmonies, which the entire Christian Middle Age had been building up, I can explain to myself only by a cooperating extra-artistic tendency in the essence of the recitative. The listener who insists on distinctly hearing the words under the music has his wishes met by the singer in that he speaks rather than sings, and intensifies the pathetic expression of the words in this half-song. By this intensification of the pathos, he facilitates the understanding of the words and surmounts the remaining half of the music. The specific danger which now threatens him is that in some unguarded moment he may give undue importance to music, which would forthwith result in the destruction of the pathos of the speech and the distinctness of the words, while, on the other hand, he always feels himself impelled to musical delivery and to virtuose exhibition of vocal talent. Here the "poet" comes to his aid, who knows how to provide him with abundant opportunities for lyrical interjections, repetitions of words and sentences, etc., at which places the singer, now in the purely musical element, can rest himself without minding the words. This alternation of emotionally impressive yet only half-sung speech and wholly sung interjections, which is characteristic of the stilo rappresentativo, this rapidly changing endeavor to operate now on the conceptional and representative faculty of the hearer, now on his musical sense, is something so thoroughly unnatural and withal so intrinsically contradictory both to the Apollonian and Dionysian artistic impulses, that one has to infer an origin of the recitative foreign to all artistic instincts. The recitative must be defined, according to this description, as the combination of epic and lyric delivery, not indeed as an intrinsically stable combination, which could not be attained in the case of such totally disparate elements, but an entirely superficial mosaic conglutination, such as is totally unprecedented in the domain of nature and experience. But this was not the opinion of the inventors of the recitative. They themselves, and their age with them, believed rather that the mystery of antique music had been solved by this stilo representativo, in which, as they thought, the only explanation of the enormous influence of an Orpheus, an Amphion, and even of Greek tragedy was to be found. The new style was regarded by them as the reawakening of the most effective music. The old Greek music, indeed, with the universal and popular conception of the Homeric world as the primitive world. They could abandon themselves to the dream of having descended once more into the paradisiac beginnings of mankind, wherein music also must needs have had the unsurpassed purity, power, and innocence of which the poets could give such touching accounts in their pastoral plays. Here we see into the internal process of development of this thoroughly modern variety of art, the opera. A powerful need here acquires in art, but it is a need of an unaesthetic kind. The yearning for the ideal, the belief in the prehistoric existence of the artistic good man. The recitative was regarded as the rediscovered language of this primitive man. The opera as the recovered land of this idyllic or heroically good creature, who in every action follows at the same time a natural artistic impulse, who sings a little along with all he has to say, in order to sing immediately with full voice on the slightest emotional excitement. It is now a matter of indifference to us that the humanists of those days combated the old ecclesiastical representation of man as naturally corrupt and lost. With this new created picture of the paradisiac artist, so that opera may be understood as the oppositional dogma of the good man, whereby, however, a solace was at the same time found for the pessimism to which precisely these seriously disposed men of that time were most strongly incited, owing to the frightful uncertainty of all conditions of life. It is enough to have perceived that the intrinsic charm, and therefore the genesis of this new form of art, lies in the gratification of an altogether unaesthetic need, in the optimistic glorification of man as such, in the conception of the primitive man as the man naturally good and artistic. A principle of the opera, which has gradually changed into a threatening and terrible demand, which in the face of the socialistic movements of the present time, we can no longer ignore. The, good primitive man, once his rights? What paradisiac prospects! I here place by way of parallel still another equally obvious confirmation of my view, that opera is built up on the same principles as our Alexandrine culture. Opera is the birth of the theoretical man, of the critical layman, not of the artist. One of the most surprising facts in the whole history of art. It was the demand of thoroughly unmusical hearers that the words must above all be understood, so that according to them, a rebirth of music is only to be expected when some mode of singing has been discovered, in which the text word lords over the counterpoint as the master over the servant. For the words, it is argued, are as much nobler than the accompanying harmonic system as the soul is nobler than the body. It was in accordance with the laically unmusical crudeness of these views that the combination of music, picture, and expression was effected in the beginnings of the opera. In the spirit of this aesthetics, the first experiments were also made in the leading laic circles of Florence by the poets and singers patronized there. The man incapable of art creates for himself a species of art precisely because he is the inartistic man as such. Because he does not divine the Dionysian depth of music, he changes his musical taste into appreciation of the understandable word and tone rhetoric of the passions in the stilo representativo, and in the voluptuousness of the arts of song. Because he is unable to behold a vision, he forces the machinist and the decorative artist into his service. Because he cannot apprehend the true nature of the artist, he conjures up the, quote, artistic primitive man, end quote, to suit his taste. That is, the man who sings and recites verses under the influence of passion. He dreams himself into a time when passion suffices to generate songs and poems, as if emotion had ever been able to create anything artistic. The postulate of the opera is a false belief concerning the artistic process. In fact, the idyllic belief that every sentient man is an artist. In the sense of this belief, opera is the expression of the taste of the laity in art, who dictate their laws with the cheerful optimism of the theorist. Should we desire to unite in one the two conceptions just set forth, as influential in the origin of opera, it would only remain for us to speak of an idyllic tendency of the opera, in which connection we may avail ourselves exclusively of the phraseology and illustration of Schiller. Quote, "Nature and the ideal," he says, "are either objects of grief when the former is represented as lost, the latter unattained, or both are objects of joy, in that they are represented as real. The first case furnishes the elegy in its narrower signification, the second the ideal in its widest sense." End quote. Here we must at once call attention to the common characteristic of these two conceptions in operatic genesis, namely, that in them the ideal is not regarded as unattained or nature as lost. Agreeably to this sentiment, there was a primitive age of man when he lay close to the heart of nature, and, owing to this naturalness, had attained the ideal of mankind in a paradisiac goodness and artist organization, from which perfect primitive man all of us were supposed to be descended, whose faithful copy we were in fact still said to be. Only we had to cast off some few things in order to recognize ourselves once more as this primitive man, on the strength of a voluntary renunciation of superfluous learnedness, of superabundant culture. It was to such a concord of nature and the ideal, to an idyllic reality, that the cultured man of the Renaissance suffered himself to be led back by his operatic imitation of Greek tragedy. He made use of this tragedy, as Dante made use of Virgil, in order to be led up to the gates of paradise, while from this point he went on without assistance, and passed over from an imitation of the highest form of Greek art to a, quote, restoration of all things, end quote, to an imitation of man's original art world. What delightfully naive hopefulness of these daring endeavors, in the very heart of theoretical culture, solely to be explained by the comforting belief that, quote, man in himself, end quote, is the eternally virtuous hero of the opera, the eternally fluting or singing shepherd, who must always in the end rediscover himself as such, if he has at any time really lost himself. Solely the fruit of the optimism, which here rises like a sweetishly seductive column of vapor, out of the depth of the Socratic conception of the world. The features of the opera, therefore, do not by any means exhibit the elegiac sorrow of an eternal loss, but rather the cheerfulness of eternal rediscovery, the indolent delight in an idyllic reality which one can at least represent to one's self each moment as real. And in so doing one will perhaps surmise one day that this supposed reality is nothing but a fantastically silly dawdling, concerning which everyone who could judge it by the terrible earnestness of true nature, and compare it with the actual primitive scenes of the beginnings of mankind, would have to call out with loathing, "Away with the phantom!" Nevertheless, one would err if one thought it possible to frighten away merely by a vigorous shout such a dawdling thing as the opera, as if it were a spectre. He who would destroy the opera must join issue with Alexandrine cheerfulness, which expresses itself so naively therein concerning its favorite representation, of which in fact it is the specific form of art. But what is to be expected for art itself from the operation of a form of art, the beginnings of which do not at all lie in the aesthetic province, which has rather stolen over from a half-moral sphere into the artistic domain, and has been able only now and then to delude us concerning this hybrid origin? By what sap is this parasitic opera concern nourished, if not by that of true art? Must we not suppose that the highest and indeed the truly serious task of art, to free the eye from its glance into the horrors of night, and to deliver the subject by the healing balm of appearance from the spasms of volitional agitations, will degenerate under the influence of its idyllic seductions and Alexandrine adulation to an empty, dissipating tendency to pastime? What will become of the eternal truths of the Dionysian and Apollonian in such an amalgamation of styles as I have exhibited in the character of the stilo rappresentativo, where music is regarded as the servant, the text as the master, where music is compared with the body, the text with the soul, where at best the highest aim will be the realization of a paraphrastic tone painting, just as formerly in the new Attic dithyramb, where music is completely alienated from its true dignity of being, the Dionysian mirror of the world, so that the only thing left to it is, as a slave of phenomena, to imitate the formal character thereof, and to excite an external pleasure in the play of lines and proportions. On close observation, this fatal influence of the opera on music is seen to coincide absolutely with the universal development of modern music. The optimism lurking in the genesis of the opera, and in the essence of culture represented thereby, has with alarming rapidity succeeded in divesting music of its Dionyso-cosmic mission, and in impressing on it a playfully formal and pleasurable character, a change with which perhaps only the metamorphosis of the Aeschylean man into the cheerful Alexandrine man could be compared. If, however, in the exemplification herewith indicated, we have rightly associated the evanescence of the Dionysian spirit with a most striking but hitherto unexplained transformation and degeneration of the Hellene, what hopes must revive in us when the most trustworthy auspices guarantee the reverse process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our modern world. It is impossible for the divine strength of Heracles to languish forever in voluptuous bondage to Omphale. Out of the Dionysian root of the German spirit, a power has arisen, which has nothing in common with the primitive conditions of Socratic culture, and can neither be explained nor excused thereby, but is rather regarded by this culture as something terribly inexplicable and overwhelmingly hostile, namely, German music, as we have to understand it, especially in its vast solar orbit from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner. What even under the most favorable circumstances can the knowledge-craving Socratism of our days do with this demon rising from unfathomable depths? Neither by means of the zigzag and arabesque work of operatic melody, nor with the aid of the arithmetical counting board of fugue and contrapuntal dialectics, is the formula to be found, in the trebly powerful light of which one could subdue this demon and compel it to speak. What a spectacle, when our aesthetes, with a net of, quote, beauty, end quote, peculiar to themselves, now pursue and clutch at the genius of music romping about before them with incomprehensible life, and in so doing display activities which are not to be judged by the standard of eternal beauty, any more than by the standard of the sublime. Let us but observe these patrons of music as they are, at close range, when they call out so indefatigably, quote, beauty, beauty, end quote, to discover whether they have the marks of nature's darling children, who are fostered and fondled in the lap of the beautiful, or whether they do not rather seek a disguise for their own rudeness, an aesthetical pretext for their own unemotional insipidity. I am thinking here, for instance, of Otto Jahn, but let the liar and the hypocrite beware of our German music, for in the midst of all our culture it is really the only genuine, pure, and purifying fire spirit from which and toward which, as in the teaching of the great Heraclitus of Ephesus, all things move in a double orbit. All that we now call culture, education, civilization, must appear some day before the unerring judge, Dionysus. Let us recollect, furthermore, how Kant and Schopenhauer made it possible for the spirit of German philosophy, streaming from the same sources, to annihilate the satisfied delight in existence of scientific Socratism by the delimitation of the boundaries thereof. How through this delimitation an infinitely profounder and more serious view of ethical problems and of art was inaugurated, which we may unhesitatingly designate as Dionysian wisdom, comprised in concepts. To what, then, does the mystery of this oneness of German music and philosophy point, if not to a new form of existence, concerning the substance of which we can only inform ourselves presentiently from Hellenic analogies? For to us who stand on the boundary line between two different forms of existence, the Hellenic prototype retains the immeasurable value that therein all these transitions and struggles are imprinted in a classically instructive form, except that we, as it were, experience analogically in reverse order the chief epics of the Hellenic genius, and seem now, for instance, to pass backwards from the Alexandrine age to the period of tragedy. At the same time, we have the feeling that the birth of a tragic age betokens only a return to itself of the German spirit, a blessed self-rediscovering after excessive and urgent external influences, have for a long time compelled it, living as it did in helpless, barbaric formlessness, to servitude under their form. It may at last, after returning to the primitive source of its being, venture to stalk along boldly and freely before all nations without hugging the leading strings of a Romanic civilization. If only it can learn implicity of one people, the Greeks, of whom to learn at all is itself a high honor and a rare distinction. And when did we require these highest of all teachers more than at present, when we experience a rebirth of tragedy, and are in danger alike of not knowing whence it comes, and of being unable to make clear to ourselves whither it tends. End of chapter 19. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 23 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 23. He who wishes to test himself rigorously as to how he is related to the true aesthetic hearer, or whether he belongs, rather, to the community of the Socrato-critical man, has only to inquire sincerely concerning the sentiment with which he accepts the wonder represented on the stage, whether he feels his historical sense, which insists on strict psychological causality, insulted by it, whether, with benevolent concession, he, as it were, admits the wonder as a phenomenon intelligible to childhood, but relinquished by him, or whether he experiences anything else thereby. For he will thus be enabled to determine how far he is, on the whole, capable of understanding myth, that is to say, the concentrated picture of the world, which as abbreviature of phenomena cannot dispense with wonder. It is probable, however, that nearly everyone, upon close examination, feels so disintegrated by the critico-historical spirit of our culture, that he can only perhaps make the former existence of myth credible to himself by learned means through intermediary abstractions. Without myth, however, every culture loses its healthy, creative, natural power. It is only a horizon encompassed with myths which rounds off to unity a social movement. It is only by myth that all the powers of the imagination and of the Apollonian dream are freed from their random rovings. The mythical figures have to be the invisibly omnipresent genii, under the care of which the young soul grows to maturity, by the signs of which the man gives a meaning to his life-end struggles, and the state itself knows no more powerful unwritten law than the mythical foundation which vouches for its connection with religion, and its growth from mythical ideas. Let us now place alongside thereof the abstract man, proceeding independently of myth, the abstract education, the abstract usage, the abstract right, the abstract state. Let us picture to ourselves the lawless roving of the artistic imagination, not bridled by any native myth. Let us imagine a culture which has no fixed and sacred primitive seal, but is doomed to exhaust all its possibilities, and has to nourish itself wretchedly from the other cultures. Such is the present, as the result of Socratism, which is bent on the destruction of myth. And now the mythless man remains eternally hungering among all the bygones, and digs and grubs for roots, though he have to dig for them even among the remotest antiquities. The stupendous historical exigency of the unsatisfied modern culture, the gathering around one of countless other cultures, the consuming desire for knowledge. What does all this point to, if not to the loss of myth, the loss of the mythical home, the mythical source? Let us ask ourselves whether the feverish and so uncanny stirring of this culture is aught but the eager seizing and snatching at food of the hungerer. And who would care to contribute anything more to a culture which cannot be appeased by all it devours, and in contact with which the most vigorous and wholesome nourishment is wont to change into, quote, history and criticism, end quote. We should also have to regard our German character with despair and sorrow, if it had already become inextricably entangled in, or even identical with this culture, in a similar manner as we can observe it to our horror to be the case in civilized France, and that which for a long time was the great advantage of France, and the cause of her vast preponderance, to wit, this very identity of people and culture, might compel us at the sight thereof to congratulate ourselves that this culture of ours, which is so questionable, has hitherto had nothing in common with the noble kernel of the character of our people. All our hopes, on the contrary, stretch out longingly toward the perception that beneath this restlessly palpitating civilized life and educational convulsion, there is concealed a glorious, intrinsically healthy primeval power, which, to be sure, stirs vigorously only at intervals in stupendous moments, and then dreams on again, in view of a future awakening. It is from this abyss that the German Reformation came forth, in the choral hymn of which the future melody of German music first resounded, so deep, courageous, and soul-breathing. So exuberantly good and tender did this chorale of Luther sound, as the first Dionysian luring call, which breaks forth from dense thickets at the approach of spring. To it responded with emulative echo the solemnly wanton procession of Dionysian revelers, to whom we are indebted for German music, and to whom we shall be indebted for the rebirth of German myth. I know that I must now lead the sympathizing and attentive friend to an elevated position of lonesome contemplation, where he will have but few companions, and I call out encouragingly to him that we must hold fast to our shining guides, the Greeks. For the rectification of our aesthetic knowledge, we previously borrowed from them the two divine figures, each of which sways a separate realm of art, and concerning whose mutual contact and exaltation we have acquired a notion through Greek tragedy. Through a remarkable disruption of both these primitive artistic impulses, the ruin of Greek tragedy seemed to be necessarily brought about, with which process a degeneration and a transmutation of the Greek national character was strictly in keeping, summoning us to earnest reflection as to how closely and necessarily art and the people, myth and custom, tragedy and the state, have coalesced in their bases. The ruin of tragedy was at the same time the ruin of myth. Until then, the Greeks had been involuntarily compelled immediately to associate all experiences with their myths. Indeed, they had to comprehend them only through this association, whereby even the most immediate present necessarily appeared to them sub specie aeterni, and in a certain sense, as timeless. Into this current of the timeless, however, the state as well as art plunged in order to find repose from the burden and eagerness of the moment. And a people, for the rest also a man, is worth just as much only as its ability to impress on its experiences the seal of eternity. For it is thus, as it were, desecularized, and reveals its unconscious inner conviction of the relativity of time and of the true, that is, the metaphysical significance of life. The contrary happens when a people begins to comprehend itself historically and to demolish the mythical bulwarks around it, with which there is usually connected a marked secularization, a breach with the unconscious metaphysics of its earlier existence in all ethical consequences. Greek art, and especially Greek tragedy, delayed above all the annihilation of myth. It was necessary to annihilate these also to be able to live detached from the native soil, unbridled in the wilderness of thought, custom, and action. Even in such circumstances, this metaphysical impulse still endeavors to create for itself a form of apotheosis, weakened, no doubt, in the Socratism of science urging to life. But on its lower stage, this same impulse led only to a feverish search, which gradually merged into a pandemonium of myths and superstitions, accumulated from all quarters, in the midst of which, nevertheless, the Hellene sat with a yearning heart till he contrived, as Grecculus, to mask his fever with Greek cheerfulness and Greek levity, or to narcotize himself completely with some gloomy Oriental superstition. We have approached this condition in the most striking manner since the reawakening of the Alexandro-Roman antiquity in the 15th century, after a long, not easily describable interlude. On the heights, there is the same exuberant love of knowledge, the same insatiate happiness of the discoverer, the same stupendous secularization, and together with these a homeless roving about, an eager intrusion at foreign tables, a frivolous deification of the present, or a dull, senseless estrangement, all subspecies seculi of the present time. Which same symptoms lead one to infer the same defect at the heart of this culture, the annihilation of myth. It seems hardly possible to transplant a foreign myth with permanent success, without dreadfully injuring the tree through this transplantation, which is perhaps occasionally strong enough and sound enough to eliminate the foreign element after a terrible struggle, but must ordinarily consume itself in a languishing and stunted condition, or in sickly luxuriance. Our opinion of the pure and vigorous kernel of the German being is such that we venture to expect of it, and only of it, this elimination of forcibly ingrafted foreign elements, and we deem it possible that the German spirit will reflect anew on itself. Perhaps many a one will be of opinion that this spirit must begin its struggles with the elimination of the Romanic element, for which it might recognize an external preparation and encouragement in the victorious bravery and bloody glory of the late war, but must seek the inner constraint in the emulative zeal to be forever worthy of the sublime protagonists on this path, of Luther, as well as our great artists and poets. But let him never think he can fight such battles without his household gods, without his mythical home, without a, quote, restoration, end quote, of all German things. And if the German should look timidly around for a guide to lead him back to his long-lost home, the ways and paths of which he knows no longer, let him but listen to the delightfully luring call of the Dionysian bird, which hovers above him, and would fain point out to him the way thither. End of chapter 23. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 22 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, Translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 22. Let the attentive friend picture to himself, purely and simply, according to his experiences, the effect of a true musical tragedy. I think I have so portrayed the phenomenon of this effect, in both its phases, that he will now be able to interpret his own experiences. For he will recollect that with regard to the myth which passed before him, he felt himself exalted to a kind of omniscience, as if his visual faculty were no longer merely a surface faculty, but capable of penetrating into the interior, and as if he now saw before him, with the aid of music, the ebullitions of the will, the conflict of motives, and the swelling stream of the passions, almost sensibly visible, like a plenitude of actively moving lines and figures, and could thereby dip into the most tender secrets of unconscious emotions. While he thus becomes conscious of the highest exaltation of his instincts for conspicuousness and transfiguration, he nevertheless feels with equal definitiveness that this long series of Apollonian artistic effects still does not generate the blissful continuance in will-less contemplation, which the plasticist and the epic poet, that is to say, the strictly Apollonian artists, produce in him by their artistic productions. To wit, the justification of the world in the individuatio, attained in this contemplation, which is the object and essence of Apollonian art. He beholds the transfigured world of the stage and nevertheless denies it. He sees before him the tragic hero in epic clearness and beauty, and nevertheless delights in his annihilation. He comprehends the incidents of the scene in all their details, and yet loves to flee into the incomprehensible. He feels the actions of the hero to be justified, and is nevertheless more elated when these actions annihilate their originator. He shudders at the sufferings which will befall the hero, and yet anticipates therein a higher and much more overpowering joy. He sees more extensively and profoundly than ever, and yet wishes to be blind. Whence must we derive this curious internal dissension, this collapse of the Apollonian apex, if not from the Dionysian spell, which, though apparently stimulating the Apollonian emotions to their highest pitch, can nevertheless force this superabundance of Apollonian power into its service? Tragic myth is to be understood only as a symbolization of Dionysian wisdom by means of the expedients of Apollonian art. The mythus conducts the world of phenomena to its boundaries, where it denies itself, and seeks to flee back again into the bosom of the true and only reality, where it then, like Isolde, seems to strike up its metaphysical swan song. Quote, "In the sea of pleasures billowing roll, in the ether waves knelling and toll, in the world breath's wavering whole, to drown in, go down in, lost in swoon, greatest boon." End quote. We thus realize to ourselves in the experiences of the truly aesthetic hearer the tragic artist himself, when he proceeds, like a luxuriously fertile divinity of individuation, to create his figures, in which sense his work can hardly be understood as an, quote, imitation of nature, end quote. And when, on the other hand, his vast Dionysian impulse then absorbs the entire world of phenomena, in order to anticipate beyond it, and through its annihilation, the highest artistic primal joy, in the bosom of the primordial unity. Of course, our aesthetes have nothing to say about this return in fraternal union of the two art deities to the original home, nor of either the Apollonian or Dionysian excitement of the hearer, when they are indefatigable in characterizing the struggle of the hero with fate, the triumph of the moral order of the world, or the disburdenment of the emotions through tragedy as the properly tragic. An indefatigableness which makes me think that they are perhaps not aesthetically excitable men at all, but only to be regarded as moral beings when hearing tragedy. Never since Aristotle has an explanation of the tragic effect been proposed, by which an aesthetic activity of the hearer could be inferred from artistic circumstances. At one time, fear and pity are supposed to be forced to an alleviating discharge through the serious procedure. At another time, we are expected to feel elevated and inspired at the triumph of good and noble principles, at the sacrifice of the hero in the interest of a moral conception of things. And however certainly I believe that for countless men precisely this and only this is the effect of tragedy, it as obviously follows therefrom that all these, together with their interpreting aesthetes, have had no experience of tragedy as the highest art. The pathological discharge, the catharsis of Aristotle, which philologists are at a loss whether to include under medicinal or moral phenomena, recalls a remarkable anticipation of Goethe. Quote, "Without a lively pathological interest," he says, "I too have never yet succeeded in elaborating a tragic situation of any kind, and hence I have rather avoided than sought it. Can it perhaps have been still another of the merits of the ancients that the deepest pathos was with them merely aesthetic play, whereas with us the truth of nature must cooperate in order to produce such a work?" End quote. We can now answer in the affirmative this latter profound question, after our glorious experiences, in which we have found to our astonishment, in the case of musical tragedy itself, that the deepest pathos can in reality be merely aesthetic play, and therefore we are justified in believing that now for the first time the proto-phenomenon of the tragic can be portrayed with some degree of success. He who now will still persist in talking only of those vicarious effects proceeding from ultra-aesthetic spheres, and does not feel himself raised above the pathologically moral process, may be left to despair of his aesthetic nature, for which we recommend to him, by way of innocent equivalent, the interpretation of Shakespeare after the fashion of Gervinus, and the diligent search for poetic justice. Thus, with the rebirth of tragedy, the aesthetic hearer is also born anew, in whose place in a theatre a curious quid pro quo was wont to sit, with half-moral and half-learned pretensions, the, quote, critic, end quote. In his sphere, hitherto, everything has been artificial and merely glossed over with a semblance of life. The performing artist was, in fact, at a loss what to do with such a critically comporting hearer, and hence he, as well as the dramatist or operatic composer who inspired him, searched anxiously for the last remains of life in a being so pretentiously barren and incapable of enjoyment. Such, quote, critics, end quote, however, have hitherto constituted the public, the student, the schoolboy, yea, even the most harmless womanly creature were already unwittingly prepared by education and by journals for a similar perception of works of art. The nobler natures among the artists counted upon exciting the moral religious forces in such a public, and the appeal to a moral order of the world operated vicariously, when in reality some powerful artistic spell should have enraptured the true hearer. Or again, some imposing, or at all events exciting tendency of the contemporary political and social world was presented by the dramatist with such vividness that the hearer could forget his critical exhaustion and abandon himself to similar emotions, as in patriotic or warlike moments, before the tribune of Parliament, or at the condemnation of crime and vice, an estrangement of the true aims of art which could not but lead directly now and then to a cult of tendency. But here there took place what has always taken place in the case of factitious arts, an extraordinary rapid depravation of these tendencies, so that, for instance, the tendency to employ the theatre as a means for the moral education of the people, which in Schiller's time was taken seriously, is already reckoned among the incredible antiquities of a surmounted culture. While the critic got the upper hand in the theatre and concert hall, the journalist in the school, and the press in society, art degenerated into a topic of conversation of the most trivial kind. An aesthetic criticism was used as the cement of a vain, distracted, selfish, and moreover piteously unoriginal sociality, the significance of which is suggested by the Schopenhauerian parable of the porcupines, so that there has never been so much gossip about art, and so little esteem for it. But is it still possible to have intercourse with a man capable of conversing on Beethoven or Shakespeare? Let each answer this question according to his sentiments. He will at any rate show by his answer his conception of, quote, culture, end quote, provided he tries at least to answer the question, and has not already grown mute with astonishment. On the other hand, many a one more nobly and delicately endowed by nature, though he may have gradually become a critical barbarian in the manner described, could tell of the unexpected as well as totally unintelligible effect which a successful performance of Lohengrin, for example, exerted on him, except that perhaps every warning and interpreting hand was lacking to guide him, so that the incomprehensibly heterogeneous and altogether incomparable sensation which then affected him also remained isolated and became extinct, like a mysterious star after a brief brilliancy. He then divined what the aesthetic hearer is. End of chapter 22. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 21 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 21. Gliding back from these hortative tones into the mood which befits the contemplative man, I repeat that it can only be learnt from the Greeks what such a sudden and miraculous awakening of tragedy must signify for the essential basis of a people's life. It is the people of the tragic mysteries who fight the battles with the Persians, and again, the people who wage such wars required tragedy as a necessary healing potion. Who would have imagined that there was still such a uniformly powerful effusion of the simplest political sentiments, the most natural domestic instincts, and the primitive manly delight in strife in this very people after it had been shaken to its foundations for several generations by the most violent convulsions of the Dionysian demon? If at every considerable spreading of the Dionysian commotion, one always perceives that the Dionysian loosing from the shackles of the individual makes itself felt first of all in an increased encroachment on the political instincts, to the extent of indifference, yea, even hostility. It is certain, on the other hand, that the state forming Apollo is also the genius of the principium individuationis, and that the state and domestic sentiment cannot live without an assertion of individual personality. There is only one way from orgasm for a people, the way to Indian Buddhism, which, in order to be at all endured with its longing for nothingness, requires the rare ecstatic states with their elevation above space, time, and the individual. Just as these in turn demand a philosophy which teaches how to overcome the indescribable depression of the intermediate states by means of a fancy. With the same necessity, owing to the unconditional dominance of political impulses, a people drifts into a path of extremist secularization, the most magnificent but also the most terrible expression of which is the Roman Imperium. Placed between India and Rome, and constrained to a seductive choice, the Greeks succeeded in devising in classical purity still a third form of life, not indeed for long private use, but just on that account for immortality. For it holds true in all things that those whom the gods love die young, but on the other hand it holds equally true that they then live eternally with the gods. One must not demand of what is most noble that it should possess the durable toughness of leather. The staunch durability which, for instance, was inherent in the national character of the Romans, does not probably belong to the indispensable predicates of perfection. But if we ask by what physic it was possible for the Greeks, in their best period, notwithstanding the extraordinary strength of their Dionysian and political impulses, neither to exhaust themselves by ecstatic brooding, nor by a consuming scramble for empire and worldly honor, but to attain the splendid mixture which we find in a noble, inflaming, and contemplatively disposing wine, we must remember the enormous power of tragedy, exciting, purifying, and disburdening the entire life of a people, the highest value of which we shall divine only when, as in the case of the Greeks, it appears to us as the essence of all the prophylactic healing forces, as the mediator arbitrating between the strongest and most inherently faithful characteristics of a people. Tragedy absorbs the highest musical orgasm into itself, so that it absolutely brings music to perfection among the Greeks, as among ourselves. But it then places alongside thereof tragic myth and the tragic hero, who, like a mighty Titan, takes the entire Dionysian world on his shoulders and disburdens us thereof, while, on the other hand, it is able by means of this same tragic myth and the person of the tragic hero to deliver us from the intense longing for this existence, and reminds us with warning hand of another existence and a higher joy, for which the struggling hero prepares himself presciently by his destruction, not by his victories. Tragedy sets a sublime symbol, namely the myth between the universal authority of its music and the receptive Dionysian hearer, and produces in him the illusion that music is only the most effective means for the animation of the plastic world of myth. Relying upon this noble illusion, she can now move her limbs for the dithyrambic dance, and abandon herself unhesitatingly to an orgiastic feeling of freedom, in which she could not venture to indulge as music itself without this illusion. The myth protects us from the music, while on the other hand, it alone gives the highest freedom thereto. By way of return for this service, music imparts to tragic myth such an impressive and convincing metaphysical significance as could never be attained by word or image, without this unique aid. And the tragic spectator in particular experiences thereby the sure presentiment of supreme joy, to which the path through destruction and negation leads, so that he thinks he hears, as it were, the innermost abyss of things speaking audibly to him. If in these last propositions I have succeeded in giving perhaps only a preliminary expression, intelligible to few at first, to this difficult representation, I must not here desist from stimulating my friends to a further attempt, or cease from beseeching them to prepare themselves, by a detached example of our common experience, for the perception of the universal proposition. In this example, I must not appeal to those who make use of the pictures of the scenic processes, the words and the emotions of the performers, in order to approximate thereby to musical perception. For none of these speak music as their mother tongue, and in spite of the aids in question, do not get farther than the precincts of musical perception, without ever being allowed to touch its innermost shrines. Some of them, like Gervinus, do not even reach the precincts by this path. I have only to address myself to those who, being immediately allied to music, have it, as it were, for their mother's lap, and are connected with things almost exclusively by unconscious musical relations. I ask the question of these genuine musicians, whether they can imagine a man capable of hearing the third act of Tristan und Isolde, without any aid of word or scenery, purely as a vast symphonic period, without expiring by a spasmodic distension of all the wings of the soul. A man who has thus, so to speak, put his ear to the heart chamber of the cosmic will, who feels the furious desire for existence issuing therefrom as a thundering stream, or most gently dispersed brook, into all the veins of the world. Would he not collapse all at once? Could he endure, in the wretched, fragile tenement of the human individual, to hear the re-echo of countless cries of joy and sorrow from the, quote, vast void of cosmic night, end quote, without flying irresistibly toward his primitive home at the sound of this pastoral dance song of metaphysics? But if, nevertheless, such a work can be heard as a whole, without a renunciation of individual existence, if such a creation could be created without demolishing its creator, where are we to get the solution of this contradiction? Here, there interpose between our highest musical excitement and the music in question the tragic myth and the tragic hero, in reality only as symbols of the most universal facts, of which music alone can speak directly. If, however, we felt as purely Dionysian beings, myth as a symbol would stand by us absolutely ineffective and unnoticed, and would never for a moment prevent us from giving ear to the re-echo of the universalia ante rem. Here, however, the Apollonian power, with a view to the restoration of the well-nigh shattered individual, bursts forth with the healing balm of a blissful illusion. All of a sudden, we imagine we see only Tristan, motionless, with hushed voice saying to himself, quote, "The old tune, why does it wake me?" End quote. And what formerly interested us like a hollow sigh from the heart of being seemed now only to tell us how, quote, "waste and void is the sea," end quote. And when breathless, we thought to expire by a convulsive distension of all our feelings, and only a slender tie bound us to our present existence. We now hear and see only the hero wounded to death, and still not dying, with his despairing cry, quote, "Longing, longing, in dying still longing, for longing, not dying." End quote. And if formerly, after such a surplus and superabundance of consuming agonies, the jubilation of the born rent our hearts almost like the very acme of agony, the rejoicing Kurvenal now stands between us and the, quote, "jubilation as such," end quote, with face turned toward the ship which carries Isolde. However powerfully fellow suffering encroaches upon us, it nevertheless delivers us in a manner from the primordial suffering of the world, just as the symbol image of the myth delivers us from the immediate perception of the highest cosmic idea, just as the thought and word deliver us from the unchecked effusion of the unconscious will. The glorious Apollonian illusion makes it appear as if the very realm of tones presented itself to us as a plastic cosmos, as if even the fate of Tristan and Isolde had been merely formed and molded therein as out of some most delicate and impressible material. Thus does the Apollonian wrest us from Dionysian universality, and fill us with rapture for individuals. To these it rivets our sympathetic emotion. Through these it satisfies the sense of beauty which longs for great and sublime forms. It brings before us biographical portraits and incites us to a thoughtful apprehension of the essence of life contained therein. With the immense potency of the image, the concept, the ethical teaching, and the sympathetic emotion, the Apollonian influence uplifts man from his orgiastic self-annihilation, and beguiles him concerning the universality of the Dionysian process into the belief that he is seeing a detached picture of the world, for instance, Tristan and Isolde, and that, through music, he will be enabled to see it still more clearly and intrinsically. What can the healing magic of Apollo not accomplish, when it can even excite in us the illusion that the Dionysian is actually in the service of the Apollonian, the effects of which it is capable of enhancing, yea, that music is essentially the representative art for an Apollonian substance? With the pre-established harmony which obtains between perfect drama and its music, the drama attains the highest degree of conspicuousness, such as is usually unattainable in mere spoken drama. As all the animated figures of the scene and the independently evolved lines of melody simplify themselves before us to the distinctness of the catenary curve, the coexistence of these lines is also audible in the harmonic change which sympathizes in a most delicate manner with the evolved process, through which change the relations of things become immediately perceptible to us in a sensible and not at all abstract manner, as we likewise perceive thereby that it is only in these relations that the essence of a character and of a line of melody manifests itself clearly. And while music thus compels us to see more extensively and more intrinsically than usual, and makes us spread out the curtain of the scene before ourselves like some delicate texture, the world of the stage is as infinitely expanded for our spiritualized, introspective eye as it is illumined outwardly from within. How can the word poet furnish anything analogous? who strives to attain this internal expansion and illumination of the visible stage world by a much more imperfect mechanism and an indirect path, proceeding as he does from word and concept. Albeit, musical tragedy likewise avails itself of the word, it is at the same time able to place alongside thereof its basis and source, and can make the unfolding of the word from within outwards obvious to us. Of the process just set forth, however, it could still be said as decidedly that it is only a glorious appearance, namely the aforementioned Apollonian illusion, through the influence of which we are to be delivered from the Dionysian obtrusion and excess. In point of fact, the relation of music to drama is precisely the reverse. Music is the adequate idea of the world. Drama is but the reflex of this idea, a detached umbrage thereof. The identity between the line of melody and the lining form, between the harmony and the character relations of this form, is true in a sense antithetical to what one would suppose on the contemplation of musical tragedy. We may agitate and enliven the form in the most conspicuous manner, and enlighten it from within, but it still continues merely phenomenon, from which there is no bridge to lead us into the true reality, into the heart of the world. Music, however, speaks out of this heart, and though countless phenomena of the kind might be passing manifestations of this music, they could never exhaust its essence, but would always be merely its externalized copies. Of course, as regards the intricate relation of music and drama, nothing can be explained, while all may be confused by the popular and thoroughly false antithesis of soul and body. But the unphilosophical crudeness of this antithesis seems to have become, who knows for what reasons, a readily accepted article of faith with our aestheticians, while they have learned nothing concerning an antithesis of phenomenon and the thing in itself, or perhaps, for reasons equally unknown, have not cared to learn anything thereof. Should it have been established by our analysis that the Apollonian element in tragedy has by means of its illusion gained a complete victory over the Dionysian primordial element of music, and has made music itself subservient to its end, namely, the highest and clearest elucidation of the drama, it would certainly be necessary to add the very important restriction, that at the most essential point, this Apollonian illusion is dissolved and annihilated. The drama, which by the aid of music spreads out before us with such inwardly illumined distinctness in all its movements and figures, that we imagine we see the texture unfolding on the loom as the shuttle flies to and fro, attains as a whole an effect which transcends all Apollonian artistic effects. In the collective effect of tragedy, the Dionysian gets the upper hand once more. Tragedy ends with a sound which could never emanate from the realm of Apollonian art, and the Apollonian illusion is thereby found to be what it is: the assiduous veiling during the performance of tragedy of the intrinsically Dionysian effect, which, however, is so powerful that it finally forces the Apollonian drama itself into a sphere where it begins to talk with Dionysian wisdom, and even denies itself and its Apollonian conspicuousness. Thus, then, the intricate relation of the Apollonian and the Dionysian in tragedy must really be symbolized by a fraternal union of the two deities. Dionysus speaks the language of Apollo. Apollo, however, finally speaks the language of Dionysus, and so the highest goal of tragedy and of art in general is attained. End of chapter 21. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 20 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 20. It may be weighed some day, before an impartial judge, in what time and in what men the German spirit has thus far striven most resolutely to learn of the Greeks. And if we confidently assume that this unique praise must be accorded to the noblest intellectual efforts of Goethe, Schiller, and Winckelmann, it will certainly have to be added that since their time, and subsequently to the more immediate influences of these efforts, the endeavor to attain to culture and to the Greeks by this path has in an incomprehensible manner grown feebler and feebler. In order not to despair altogether of the German spirit, we must not infer therefrom that possibly in some essential matter even these champions could not penetrate into the core of the Hellenic nature, and were unable to establish a permanent friendly alliance between German and Greek culture, so that perhaps an unconscious perception of this shortcoming might raise also in more serious minds the disheartening doubt as to whether after such predecessors they could advance still farther on this path of culture, or could reach the goal at all. Accordingly, we see the opinions concerning the value of Greek contribution to culture degenerate since that time, in the most alarming manner. The expression of compassionate superiority may be heard in the most heterogeneous intellectual and non-intellectual camps, and elsewhere. A totally ineffective declamation dallies with, quote, Greek harmony, quote, Greek beauty, quote, Greek cheerfulness, end quote. And in the very circles whose dignity it might be to draw indefatigably from the Greek channel for the good of German culture, in the circles of the teachers in the higher educational institutions, they have learned best to compromise with the Greeks in good time, and on easy terms, to the extent often of a skeptical abandonment of the Hellenic ideal, and a total perversion of the true purpose of antiquarian studies. If there be anyone at all in these circles who has not completely exhausted himself in the endeavor to be a trustworthy corrector of old texts, or a natural history microscopist of language, he perhaps seeks also to appropriate Grecian antiquity, quote, historically, end quote, along with other antiquities, and in any case according to the method and with the supercilious air of our present cultured historiography. When, therefore, the intrinsic efficiency of the higher educational institutions has never perhaps been lower or feebler than at present, when the, quote, journalist, end quote, the paper slave of the day, has triumphed over the academic teacher in all matters pertaining to culture, and there only remains to the latter the often previously experienced metamorphosis of now fluttering, also, as a cheerful, cultured butterfly, in the idiom of the journalist, with the, quote, light elegance, end quote, peculiar thereto. With what painful confusion must the cultured persons of a period like the present gaze at the phenomenon, which we can perhaps be comprehended analogically only by means of the profoundest principle of the hitherto unintelligible Hellenic genius, of the reawakening of the Dionysian spirit and the rebirth of tragedy. Never has there been another art period in which so-called culture and true art have been so estranged and opposed, as is so obviously the case at present. We understand why so feeble a culture hates true art. It fears destruction thereby. But must not an entire domain of culture, namely the Socratic Alexandrine, have exhausted its powers after contriving to culminate in such a daintily tapering point as our present culture? when it was not permitted to heroes like Goethe and Schiller to break open the enchanted gate which leads into the Hellenic magic mountain, when with their most dauntless striving they did not get beyond the longing gaze which the Goethean Iphigenia cast from barbaric Taurus to her home across the ocean. What could the epigonies of such heroes hope for, if the gate should not open to them suddenly of its own accord, and an entirely different position, quite overlooked in all endeavors of culture hitherto, amidst the mystic tones of reawakened tragic music? Let no one attempt to weaken our faith in an impending rebirth of Hellenic antiquity, for in it alone we find our hope of a renovation and purification of the German spirit through the fire magic of music. What else do we know of amidst the present desolation and languor of culture, which could awaken any comforting expectation for the future? We look in vain for one single vigorously branching root, for a speck of fertile and healthy soil. There is dust, sand, torpidness, and languishing everywhere. Under such circumstances, a cheerless, solitary wanderer could choose for himself no better symbol than the night with death and the devil, as Dürer has sketched him for us, the mail-clad knight, grim and stern of visage, who is able, unperturbed by his gruesome companions, and yet hopelessly, to pursue his terrible path with horse and hound alone. Our Schopenhauer was such a Dürerian knight. He was destitute of all hope, but he sought the truth. There is not his equal. But how suddenly this gloomily depicted wilderness of our exhausted culture changes when the Dionysian magic touches it! A hurricane seizes everything decrepit, decaying, collapsed, and stunted, wraps it whirlingly into a red cloud of dust, and carries it like a vulture into the air. Confused thereby, our glances seek for what has vanished, for what they see is something risen to the golden light as from a depression, so full and green, so luxuriantly alive, so ardently infinite. Tragedy sits in the midst of this exuberance of life, sorrow, and joy, in sublime ecstasy. She listens to a distant, doleful song. It tells of the mothers of being, whose names are Van, Will, Wehe. Yes, my friends, believe with me in Dionysian life and in the rebirth of tragedy. The time of the Socratic man is past. Crown yourselves with ivy. Take in your hands the thyrsus, and do not marvel if tigers and panthers lie down fawning at your feet. Dare now to be tragic men, for ye are to be redeemed. Ye are to accompany the Dionysian festive procession from India to Greece. Equip yourselves for severe conflict, but believe in the wonders of your God. End of chapter 20. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 25 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 25. Music and tragic myth are equally the expression of the Dionysian capacity of a people, and are inseparable from each other. Both originate in an ultra-Apollonian sphere of art. Both transfigure a region into the delightful accords of which all dissonance, just like the terrible picture of the world, dies charmingly away. Both play with the sting of displeasure, trusting to their most potent magic. Both justify thereby the existence even of the, quote, worst world." End quote. Here, the Dionysian, as compared with the Apollonian, exhibits itself as the eternal and original artistic force, which in general calls into existence the entire world of phenomena, in the midst of which a new transfiguring appearance becomes necessary, in order to keep alive the animated world of individuation. If we could conceive an incarnation of dissonance, and what is man but that? Then, to be able to live this dissonance would require a glorious illusion, which would spread a veil of beauty over its peculiar nature. This is the true function of Apollo as deity of art, in whose name we comprise all the countless manifestations of the fair realm of illusion. With each moment, render life in general worth living, and make one impatient for the experience of the next moment. At the same time, just as much of this basis of all existence, the Dionysian substratum of the world, is allowed to enter into the consciousness of human beings, as can be surmounted again by the Apollonian transfiguring power, so that these two art impulses are constrained to develop their powers in strictly mutual proportion, according to the law of eternal justice. When the Dionysian powers rise with such vehemence as we experience at present, there can be no doubt, veiled in a cloud, Apollo has already descended to us, whose grandest beautifying influences a coming generation will perhaps behold. That this effect is necessary, however, each one would most surely perceive by intuition, if once he found himself carried back, even in a dream, into an old Hellenic existence. In walking under high Ionic colonnades, looking upwards to a horizon defined by clear and noble lines, with reflections of his transfigured form by his side in shining marble, and around him solemnly marching or quietly moving men, with harmoniously sounding voices and rhythmical pantomime. Would he not, in the presence of this perpetual influx of beauty, have to raise his hand to Apollo and exclaim, quote, "Blessed race of Hellenes, how great Dionysus must be among you, when the Delian god deems such charms necessary to cure you of your dithyrambic madness." End quote. To one in this frame of mind, however, an aged Athenian looking up to him with the sublime eye of Aeschylus might answer, quote, "Say also this, thou curious stranger, what sufferings this people must have undergone, in order to be able to become thus beautiful. But now follow me to a tragic play, and sacrifice with me in the temple of both the deities." End quote. End of chapter 25. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 24 of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 24. Among the peculiar artistic effects of musical tragedy, we had to emphasize an Apollonian illusion, through which we are to be saved from immediate oneness with the Dionysian music, while our musical excitement is able to discharge itself on an Apollonian domain and in an interposed visible middle world. It thereby seemed to us that precisely through this discharge, the middle world of theatrical procedure, the drama generally, became visible and intelligible from within in a degree unattainable in the other forms of Apollonian art. So that here, where this art was, as it were, winged and borne aloft by the spirit of music, we had to recognize the highest exaltation of its powers, and consequently, in the fraternal union of Apollo and Dionysus, the climax of the Apollonian as well as of the Dionysian artistic aims. Of course, the Apollonian light picture did not, precisely with this inner illumination through music, attain the peculiar effect of the weaker grades of Apollonian art. What the epos and the animated stone can do, constrain the contemplating eye to calm delight in the world of the individuatio, could not be realized here, notwithstanding the greater animation and distinctness. We contemplated the drama, and penetrated with piercing glance into its inner agitated world of motives, and yet it seemed as if only a symbolic picture passed before us, the profoundest significance of which we almost believed we had divined, and which we desired to put aside, like a curtain, in order to behold the original behind it. The greatest distinctness of the picture did not suffice us, for it seemed to reveal as well as veil something. And while it seemed, with its symbolic revelation, to invite the rending of the veil for the disclosure of the mysterious background, this illumined all-conspicuousness itself enthralled the eye, and prevented it from penetrating more deeply. He who has not experienced this, to have to view and at the same time to have a longing beyond the viewing, will hardly be able to conceive how clearly and definitely these two processes coexist in the contemplation of tragic myth, and are felt to be conjoined. While the truly aesthetic spectators will confirm my assertion that among the peculiar effects of tragedy this conjunction is the most noteworthy. Now, let this phenomenon of the aesthetic spectator be transferred to an analogous process in the tragic artist, and the genesis of tragic myth will have been understood. It shares with the Apollonian sphere of art the full delight in appearance and contemplation, and at the same time it denies this delight and finds a still higher satisfaction in the annihilation of the visible world of appearance. The substance of tragic myth is first of all an epic event, involving the glorification of the fighting hero. But whence originates the essentially enigmatical trait that the suffering in the fate of the hero, the most painful victories, the most agonizing contrasts of motives, in short, the exemplification of the wisdom of Silenus, or aesthetically expressed, the ugly and discordant, is always represented anew in such countless forms with such predilection, and precisely in the most youthful and exuberant age of a people, unless there is really a higher delight experienced in all this. For the fact that things actually take such a tragic course would least of all explain the origin of a form of art, provided that art is not merely an imitation of the reality of nature, but in truth a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature, placed alongside thereof for its conquest. Tragic myth, insofar as it really belongs to art, also fully participates in this transfiguring metaphysical purpose of art in general. What does it transfigure, however, when it presents the phenomenal world in the guise of the suffering hero? Least of all the, quote, reality, end quote, of this phenomenal world, for it says to us, quote, "Look at this, look carefully. It is your life. It is the hour hand of your clock. of existence." End quote. And myth has displayed this life in order thereby to transfigure it to us? If not, how shall we account for the aesthetic pleasure with which we make even these representations pass before us? I am inquiring concerning the aesthetic pleasure, and am well aware that many of these representations may, moreover, occasionally create even a moral delectation, say under the form of pity, or of a moral triumph. But he who would derive the effect of the tragic exclusively from these moral sources, as was usually the case far too long in aesthetics, let him not think that he has done anything for art thereby. For art must above all insist on purity in her domain. For the explanation of tragic myth, the very first requirement is that the pleasure which characterizes it must be sought in the purely aesthetic sphere, without encroaching on the domain of pity, fear, or the morally sublime. How can the ugly and the discordant, the substance of tragic myth, excite an aesthetic pleasure? Here it is necessary to raise ourselves with a daring bound into a metaphysics of art. I repeat, therefore, my former proposition, that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world appear justified. And in this sense, it is precisely the function of tragic myth to convince us that even the ugly and discordant is an artistic game which the will, in the eternal fullness of its joy, plays with itself. But this not easily comprehensible proto-phenomenon of Dionysian art becomes, in a direct way, singularly intelligible, and is immediately apprehended in the wonderful significance of musical dissonance. Just as in general it is music alone, placed in contrast to the world, which can give us an idea as to what is meant by the justification of the world as an aesthetic phenomenon. The joy that tragic myth excites has the same origin as the joyful sensation of dissonance in music. The Dionysian, with its primitive joy experienced in pain itself, is the common source of music and tragic myth. Is it not possible that by calling to our aid the musical relation of dissonance, the difficult problem of tragic effect may have meanwhile been materially facilitated? For we now understand what it means to wish to view tragedy, and at the same time to have a longing beyond the viewing. A frame of mind, which, as regards the artistically employed dissonance, we should simply have to characterize by saying that we desire to hear, and at the same time have a longing beyond the hearing. That striving for the infinite, the pinion flapping of longing, accompanying the highest delight in the clearly perceived reality, remind one that in both states we have to recognize a Dionysian phenomenon, which again and again reveals to us anew the playful upbuilding and demolishing of the world of individuals as the efflux of a primitive delight. In like manner, as when Heraclitus the Obscure compares the world-building power to a playing child which places stones here and there, and builds sand-hills only to overthrow them again. Hence, in order to form a true estimate of the Dionysian capacity of a people, it would seem that we must think not only of their music, but just as much of their tragic myth, the second witness of this capacity. Considering this most intimate relationship between music and myth, we may now in like manner suppose that a degeneration and deprivation of the one involves a deterioration of the other. If it be true at all that the weakening of the myth is generally expressive of a debilitation of the Dionysian capacity. Concerning both, however, a glance at the development of the German genius should not leave us in any doubt. In the opera, just as in the abstract character of our mythless existence, in an art sunk to pastime, just as in a life guided by concepts, the inartistic as well as life-consuming nature of Socratic optimism had revealed itself to us. Yet, there have been indications to console us, and nevertheless, in some inaccessible abyss, the German spirit still rests and dreams. Undestroyed, in glorious health, profundity, and Dionysian strength, like a knight sunk in slumber, from which abyss the Dionysian song rises to us to let us know that this German knight even still dreams his primitive Dionysian myth in blissfully earnest visions. Let no one believe that the German spirit has forever lost its mythical home, when it still understands so obviously the voices of the birds which tell of that home. Some day it will find itself awake in all the morning freshness of a deep sleep. Then it will slay the dragons, destroy the malignant dwarfs, and waken Brunhilde, and Wotan's spirit self will be unable to obstruct its course. My friends, ye who believe in Dionysian music, ye know also what tragedy means to us. There, we have tragic myth born anew from music. And in this latest birth, ye can hope for everything, and forget what is most afflicting. What is most afflicting, to all of us, however, is the prolonged degradation in which the German genius has lived estranged from house and home, in the service of malignant dwarfs. Ye understand my illusion, as ye will also, in conclusion, understand my hopes. End of chapter 24. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Appendix and Translator's Note of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by William Hausmann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix. Translator's Note. Late in the year 1888, not long before he was overcome by his sudden attack of insanity, Nietzsche wrote down a few notes concerning his early work, The Birth of Tragedy. These were printed in his sister's biography, Das Leben Friedrich Nietzsches, Volume 2, Part 1, pages 102 and so on, and are here translated as likely to be of interest to readers of this remarkable work. They also appear in Ecce Homo. End translator's note. 1. To be just to the birth of tragedy, one will have to forget some few things. It has wrought effects. It even fascinated through that wherein it was amiss, through its application to Wagnerism, just as if this Wagnerism were symptomatic of a rise and going up. And just on that account was the book an event in Wagner's life. From thence, and only from thence, were great hopes linked to the name of Wagner. Even today, people remind me sometimes, right in the midst of a talk on Parsifal, that I, and none other, have it on my conscience that such a high opinion of the cultural value of this movement came to the top. More than once have I found the book referred to as, quote, the rebirth of tragedy out of the spirit of music," one only had an ear for a new formula of Wagner's art, aim, task, and failed to hear withal what was at bottom valuable therein. "Hellenism and Pessimism," had been a more unequivocal title, namely, as a first lesson on the way in which the Greeks got the better of pessimism, on the means whereby they overcame it. Tragedy simply proves that the Greeks were no pessimists. Schopenhauer was mistaken here as he was mistaken in all other things. Considered with some neutrality, the birth of tragedy appears very unseasonable. One would not even dream that it was begun amid the thunders of the Battle of Worth. I thought these problems through and through before the walls of Metz, in cold September nights, in the midst of the work of nursing the sick. One might even believe the book to be 50 years older. It is politically indifferent, un-German, one will say today. It smells shockingly Hegelian. In but a few formulae does it scent of Schopenhauer's funereal perfume. In, idea, the antithesis of, Dionysian versus Apollonian, translated into metaphysics. History itself as the evolution of this, idea, the antithesis dissolved into oneness in tragedy. Through this optics, things that had never looked into one another's face, confronted of a sudden, and illumined and comprehended through one another. For instance, opera and revolution. The two decisive innovations of the book are, on the one hand, the comprehension of the Dionysian phenomenon among the Greeks. It gives the first psychology thereof. It sees therein the one root of all Grecian art. On the other, the comprehension of Socratism. Socrates, diagnosed for the first time as the tool of Grecian dissolution, as a typical decadent, rationality, against instinct. Rationality, at any price, as a dangerous, as a life-undermining force. Throughout the whole book, a deep hostile silence on Christianity. It is neither Apollonian nor Dionysian. It negatives all aesthetic values, the only values recognized by the birth of tragedy. It is, in the widest sense, nihilistic. Whereas in the Dionysian symbol the utmost limit of affirmation is reached. Once or twice, the Christian priests are alluded to as a, malignant kind of dwarves, as, subterraneans, 2. This beginning is singular beyond measure. I had from my own inmost experience discovered the only symbol and counterpart of history. I had just thereby been the first to grasp the wonderful phenomenon of the Dionysian. And again, through my diagnosing Socrates as a decadent, I had given a wholly unequivocal proof of how little risk the trustworthiness of my psychological grasp would run of being weakened by some moralistic idiosyncrasy. To view morality itself as a symptom of decadence is an innovation, a novelty of the first rank in the history of knowledge. How far I had leaped in either case beyond the smug, shallow pate gossip of optimism contra pessimism. I was the first to see the intrinsic antithesis. Here, the degenerating instinct which, with subterranean vindictiveness, turns against life. Christianity, the philosophy of Schopenhauer, in a certain sense already the philosophy of Plato, all idealistic systems as typical forms. And there, a formula of highest affirmation, born of fullness and over fullness, a yea-saying without reserve to suffering's self, to guilt's self, to all that is questionable and strange in existence itself. This final, cheerfulest, exuberantly mad and merriest yea to life is not only the highest insight, it is also the deepest. It is that which is most rigorously confirmed and upheld by truth and science. Naught that is to be deduced. Naught is dispensable. The phase of existence rejected by the Christians and other nihilists are even of an infinitely higher order in the hierarchy of values than that which the instinct of decadence sanctions, yea, durst sanction. To comprehend this, courage is needed, and as a condition thereof, a surplus of strength. For precisely in degree as courage dares to thrust forward, precisely according to the measure of strength does one approach truth. Perception, the yea-saying to reality, is as much a necessity to the strong as to the weak. Under the inspiration of weakness, cowardly shrinking and flight from reality, the, quote, ideal, end quote. They are not free to perceive. The decadents have need of the lie. It is one of their conditions of self-preservation. Whoso not only comprehends the word Dionysian, but also grasps his self in this word, requires no refutation of Plato, or of Christianity, or of Schopenhauer. He smells the putrefaction. 3. To what extent I had just thereby found the concept, quote, tragic, end quote. The definitive perception of the psychology of tragedy I have but lately stated in the Twilight of the Idols, page 139, first edit. Quote, the affirmation of life, even in its most unfamiliar and severe problems, the will to life, enjoying its own inexhaustibility in the sacrifice of its highest types. That is what I called Dionysian. That is what I divined as the bridge to a psychology of the tragic poet. Not in order to get rid of terror and pity, not to purify from a dangerous passion by its vehement discharge. It was thus that Aristotle misunderstood it. But beyond terror and pity, to realize in fact the eternal delight of becoming, that delight which even involves in itself the joy of annihilating. In this sense, I have the right to understand myself to be the first tragic philosopher. That is, the utmost antithesis and antipode to a pessimistic philosopher. Prior to myself, there is no such translation of the Dionysian into the philosophic pathos. There lacks the tragic wisdom. I have sought in vain for an indication thereof, even among the great Greeks of philosophy, the thinkers of the 2 centuries before Socrates. A doubt still possessed me as touching Heraclitus, in whose proximity I, in general, begin to feel warmer and better than anywhere else. The affirmation of transiency and annihilation. To wit, the decisive factor in a Dionysian philosophy, the yea-saying to antithesis and war, to becoming, with radical rejection even of the concept, quote, being, end quote. That I must directly acknowledge as, of all thinking hitherto, the nearest to my own. The doctrine of, quote, eternal recurrence, end quote. That is, of the unconditioned and infinitely repeated cycle of all things. This doctrine of Zarathustra's might, after all, have been already taught by Heraclitus. At any rate, the Portico, which inherited well-nigh all its fundamental conceptions from Heraclitus, shows traces thereof. 4. In this book speaks a prodigious hope. In fine, I see no reason whatever for taking back my hope of a Dionysian future for music. Let us cast a glance a century ahead. Let us suppose my assault upon 2 millenniums of anti-nature and man-vilification succeeds. That new party of life which will take in hand the greatest of all tasks, the upbreeding of mankind to something higher. Add thereto the relentless annihilation of all things degenerating and parasitic, will again make possible on earth that too much of life, from which there also must needs grow again the Dionysian state. I promise a tragic age. The highest art in the yea-saying to life, tragedy, will be born anew when mankind hath behind them consciousness of the hardest but most necessary wars, without suffering therefrom. A psychologist might still add that what I heard in my younger years in Wagnerian music had in general naught to do with Wagner. That when I described Wagnerian music, I described what I had heard, that I had instinctively to translate and transfigure all into the new spirit which I bore within myself. Translator's note. While the translator flatters himself that this version of Nietzsche's early work, having been submitted to unsparingly scrutinizing eyes, is not altogether unworthy of the original, he begs to state that he holds 20th century English to be a rather unsatisfactory vehicle for philosophical thought. Accordingly, in conjunction with his friend Dr. Ernest Lacey, he has prepared a second, more unconventional translation. In brief, a translation which will enable one whose knowledge of English extends to, say, the period of Elizabeth, to appreciate Nietzsche in more forcible language, because the language of a stronger age. It is proposed to provide this second translation with an appendix, containing many references to the translated writings of Wagner and Schopenhauer, to the works of Pater, Browning, Burckhardt, Roda, and others, and a summary and index. For help in preparing the present translation, the translator wishes to express his thanks to his friends, Dr. Ernest Lacey, Dr. James Waddell Tupper, Professor Harry Max Ferrin, Mr. James McCurdy, and Mr. Thomas Common. End of appendix and translator's note. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. End of The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by William Hausmann. Thank you for listening.